Have you ever had the strange feeling that someone wanted to say something to you, but didn't? Not because they had nothing to say, because what they wanted to say felt too heavy, too revealing, too real. And if you're watching this alone tonight, I want to ask you something. What if the thing you've been waiting to hear isn't actually missing? What if it's sitting silently inside someone right now? A woman, someone who knows your name, someone who remembers more about you than you realize, someone who has replayed conversations in her mind long after they ended. Before we go any further, if you've ever found yourself searching for answers about people who seemed impossible to read, subscribe. Not because I need another number on a screen, but because some conversations deserve to continue, and I have a feeling this one might stay with you. Now, I want you to imagine something. It's late. The day is finally quiet. She's alone with her thoughts.
No distractions, no messages coming in, no performance, no pretending. Just silence. And somehow, in that silence, you appear. Not because she forced the thought, not because she planned it. You simply showed up. The way certain people do. The way a particular song suddenly starts playing in your head. The way a memory walks through the door without knocking. Most men think attraction is loud, obvious, dramatic. But some of the deepest emotional experiences happen in complete silence. A woman can spend days appearing perfectly normal while carrying an entire conversation inside herself. Things she wishes she had said, things she almost admitted, things she hoped you somehow understood without her saying them. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the words she wants to say have nothing to do with romance. Not at first. Sometimes they're much simpler, much more human. I miss talking to you. I feel safe around you. You don't realize how much I think about what you said. I wish I could stop wondering about you. Those sentences sound small, but psychologically, they're enormous, because every one of them requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is expensive. People talk about fear of rejection all the time. What they don't talk about enough is fear of exposure. The fear that someone will finally see what you feel and not hold it with care. That fear doesn't belong only to men. Women carry it too, more often than most men realize. You see, when a woman genuinely values someone, she doesn't become fearless. She becomes careful. And careful people don't always speak. Sometimes they watch. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they convince themselves that silence is safer than honesty. Meanwhile, the man on the other side assumes nothing is happening, assumes she moved on, assumes she doesn't care, assumes if she felt something, she would have said it. But human beings aren't nearly that simple, especially when emotions become meaningful. I've spent years listening to people describe relationships that never officially became relationships. And the stories always sound different on the surface. Different cities, different ages, different circumstances. Yet underneath them all is the same quiet ache. Two people feeling more than they admitted. Two people waiting for certainty before risking honesty. Two people hoping the other person would somehow go first. And maybe that's why this topic feels so personal. Because almost every man has experienced a moment where he sensed something deeper beneath someone's words. A pause that lasted a second too long. A look that lingered. A goodbye that felt unfinished. And years later, he still wonders. Not because he's obsessed, not because he can't move on, but because unanswered emotions have a strange way of remaining alive. They don't disappear. They simply become quieter. And tonight, I want to explore something many men never consider. Sometimes the thing a woman most wants to say isn't hidden behind games. It's hidden behind fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of needing someone. Fear of discovering that what feels significant to her might not feel significant to you. And that's where this story really begins. There is a moment that happens in more relationships than people admit. A quiet moment. Nothing dramatic, No argument, no grand confession, no movie scene. Just a realization. And it usually sounds something like this. Why do I keep thinking about him? Not once, not twice, but over and over again. The interesting thing about emotional attachment is that it rarely announces itself when it arrives. Most people expect powerful feelings to enter their lives like a storm. Instead, they often arrive like a slow change in temperature, so gradual that you don't notice it happening until the room feels completely different. A woman may tell herself she's simply curious about you. Then she notices she's paying attention to details. The way you react when you're disappointed. The way your voice changes when you're passionate about something. The things you joke about when you're nervous. The things you never joke about. And without realizing it, she's no longer observing you. She's learning you. There's a difference, a very important difference. Observation is casual. Learning someone is emotional. Because learning someone requires investment, time, attention, mental space. And attention is one of the most valuable things a human being can give another person. Yet most men never see this part, because it happens privately. No audience, no evidence, no announcement. Just countless small moments where you occupy space in her mind. Maybe she hears something during her day and instantly thinks of you. Maybe she sees something you'd find funny. Maybe she catches herself wanting to tell you a story before remembering you're not there. Those moments sound insignificant, but psychologically, they're not. They're signs that someone has become emotionally integrated into another person's internal world. You stop being an event. You become part of the landscape. And that's exactly why the feelings become frightening. Because once someone becomes part of your emotional landscape, losing them feels different. Now, I want to tell you something many men misunderstand. When a woman becomes emotionally affected by a man, she doesn't always move closer. Sometimes she becomes more distant. I know that sounds backward, but stay with me. People often pull away from things they care about when those things start feeling important. Not because they want less, because they suddenly have more to lose. Imagine standing at the edge of a deep pool. When the water is shallow, you walk in confidently. When you realize it's deeper than you expected, you slow down. You become cautious. You test every step. Emotionally, people do the same thing, especially if they've been hurt before, especially if they've trusted the wrong people, especially if they've spent years convincing themselves they don't need anyone. Because then someone arrives. Someone who makes those protective walls feel unnecessary. And instead of feeling relief, they feel exposed. It's strange, isn't it? The very person who makes you feel understood can also become the person you're most afraid of losing. That's the contradiction nobody talks about. And if she could grab your hand in one of those private moments when nobody else is around, if she could silence all the fear and overthinking for just a few seconds, the words might not be what you expect. They might not be romantic. They might not be dramatic. They might simply be, "You matter more than I planned." Think about that. Not more than she wanted, more than she planned. Because very few people intentionally choose deep emotional attachment. Most stumble into it. One conversation at a time. One shared laugh. One unexpected moment of understanding. Until one day they realize the person across from them has become emotionally significant. And significance changes everything. It changes how silence feels. It changes how absence feels. It changes how uncertainty feels. Suddenly, unanswered messages feel longer. Goodbyes feel heavier. Distance feels larger. Not because someone is weak, because they're human. And if you've ever wondered why certain women seem like they're fighting an invisible battle inside themselves, why they sometimes appear warm one day and distant the next, why they seem close, then cautious, it may not be because they're confused about you. Sometimes they're trying to understand what your presence has awakened inside themselves. And that's a much deeper struggle than most people realize. Because once someone starts becoming emotionally important, the question is no longer, what do I think about him? The question becomes, what am I supposed to do with what I feel? And for many people, that's where the real conflict begins. The real conflict isn't falling for someone. The real conflict is realizing how much power the truth has. Because there comes a point when feelings stop being theoretical. They stop being interesting thoughts. They stop being little emotional sparks that can be ignored. They become real. And reality demands a choice. Say something or stay silent. Most people think silence means a lack of courage. But after years of listening to people talk about their relationships, their heartbreaks, and the things they never said, I've learned something different. Silence is often full of courage, just pointed in the wrong direction. Sometimes it takes courage to confess. Sometimes it takes courage to hide. And many people spend years choosing the second option, not because it's healthy, because it feels safer. Imagine a woman sitting across from you. She's smiling, the conversation is flowing, everything looks normal. But beneath that calm surface, there's a second conversation happening, a private one you'll never hear. She's wondering if you're aware of the effect you have on her, wondering if you notice the way she remembers tiny details, wondering if you're as emotionally present as you seem, wondering whether opening up would bring her closer to you or push you away. The strange thing about emotional risk is that it doesn't feel risky at first. It feels embarrassing. That's the part people rarely talk about. Not fear, embarrassment. The possibility of being seen, truly seen, without certainty, without guarantees, without knowing how the story ends. For many people, that's terrifying. Because once feelings are spoken aloud, they become real in a new way. They can no longer hide inside imagination. And imagination is comfortable. Reality is not. Reality can answer you. Reality can disappoint you. Reality can reveal things you weren't prepared to learn. So people wait. Weeks, months, sometimes years, telling themselves they're being patient, telling themselves they're being practical, when underneath it all, they're protecting a fragile hope, a hope that remains perfect as long as it's never tested. Maybe you've done this too. Most people have. Maybe not with a relationship, maybe with a dream, a conversation, a decision, something that mattered enough to scare you. Because the greater the emotional value, the greater the temptation to avoid certainty. And this is where many men misunderstand what they're seeing. They assume confidence always looks confident. It doesn't. Sometimes confidence looks calm. Sometimes vulnerability looks distant. Sometimes care looks like hesitation. Human emotions are messy like that. A woman can genuinely care about someone and still hesitate. She can genuinely miss someone and still remain quiet. She can genuinely wish for connection while simultaneously protecting herself from it. Those contradictions aren't signs of manipulation. They're signs of being human. And if she could be completely honest, not polished, not guarded, not trying to appear strong, just honest, the thing she may want to tell you isn't actually about romance at all. It's about impact. Because impact is what lingers. Impact is what keeps people awake at night. Impact is what turns an ordinary person into an unforgettable one. She might want to tell you, you changed something in me. Not dramatically, not magically, but subtly, the way meaningful people often do. Maybe you made her feel understood in a season when she felt invisible. Maybe you reminded her of qualities she'd forgotten she valued. Maybe your presence challenged beliefs she'd spent years carrying. Maybe you simply treated her with a level of consistency she wasn't used to. Whatever the reason, the impact stayed. And that's why certain people become difficult to forget. Not because they were perfect, not because they were extraordinary, Because they arrived at the right emotional moment, a moment when something inside another person was ready to change. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Many men spend years focusing on whether a woman likes them, while completely overlooking whether they've affected her. But impact is often the deeper story. Attraction can fade. Curiosity can fade. Excitement can fade. But impact? Impact settles into memory. It becomes part of how someone understands themselves. And when that happens, the feelings become much harder to explain. Because now it's no longer about wanting someone's attention. It's about missing the version of yourself that existed when they were close. That's why some words remain trapped inside people. Not because those words are weak, because they're powerful. Powerful enough to change everything once spoken. And when someone realizes that, they often hold them back a little longer, just a little longer, hoping for the perfect moment, not realizing that the perfect moment rarely arrives at all. The older I get, the more convinced I become that most emotional pain isn't created by rejection. It's created by uncertainty. Rejection hurts, of course it does, but rejection eventually gives you something valuable, a reality you can stand on, an answer, a direction. Uncertainty is different. Uncertainty keeps the door slightly open, just enough for hope to survive, just enough for questions to keep breathing. And questions have a remarkable ability to follow people for years, especially when someone mattered, especially when the connection felt real. You know what's fascinating? When people talk about the relationships they regret most, they're often not talking about relationships at all. They're talking about possibilities. The person they almost called, the conversation they almost had, the feelings they almost admitted, the chance they almost took. Those memories linger because the mind naturally tries to complete unfinished stories. It's part of human psychology. We search for conclusions. We crave emotional resolution. When we don't get it, our imagination steps in and starts writing possibilities. Maybe she felt the same. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she wanted me to stay. Maybe she was relieved when I left. Maybe she was waiting. Maybe she wasn't. And so the story continues, not in reality, inside the mind, over and over. Meanwhile, somewhere else, another person may be carrying her own version of the same questions. That's the part people rarely consider. The silent conversations happening on both sides. The assumptions. The misunderstandings. The words that never made it into the room. Because life has an odd way of placing two people close enough to affect each other, yet not always close enough to understand each other completely. And sometimes, if a woman truly wishes she could pull you into a quiet moment and finally speak without fear. The thing she wants isn't necessarily a romantic ending. It might be understanding, real understanding, the kind that goes deeper than attraction, deeper than chemistry, deeper than labels. She might want you to know that her silence was never indifference, that her distance wasn't always absence, that some of the moments you questioned meant more than you realized. Because here's something men often don't hear enough. Not every meaningful feeling becomes a relationship, but that doesn't make it meaningless. Some people enter your life to stay. Others enter your life to change you. Both matter. Both leave marks. And when someone leaves a mark, there is often a hidden grief attached to it. Not grief because they disappeared. Grief because they mattered. There's a difference. I think many men carry a private wound they never talk about. The wound of believing that if something didn't become official, it wasn't real. If there was no title, no commitment, no clear outcome, then maybe the feelings were imagined. Maybe they exaggerated everything. Maybe it was all in their head. But human emotions don't work that way. The heart doesn't check paperwork before it decides something is significant. It doesn't wait for certainty. It doesn't ask permission. It simply responds. And that's why some connections stay with us. Not because they fulfilled every hope, because they revealed something about ourselves, about what we value, about what we're capable of feeling. If she could speak freely, completely free of pride, fear, and self-protection, she might tell you that your value was never measured by how perfectly things turned out. She might tell you that people are not remembered only for what they gave. They're remembered for how they made someone feel. Safe, seen, respected, understood, alive. Those experiences become emotional landmarks. And emotional landmarks don't disappear. Years can pass. Lives can change. People can move in different directions. Yet certain memories remain untouched. Not because someone is stuck, because something meaningful happened there. And meaning has a way of surviving time. Which leads to a difficult realization. Sometimes the words someone wants to say aren't about changing the future. They're about honoring the truth. The truth that a connection existed. The truth that it mattered. The truth that pretending otherwise would be dishonest. And for some people, that truth sits quietly inside them for a very long time, waiting. Not for the perfect outcome, just for the courage to finally be spoken. And maybe that's where we need to end tonight. Not with certainty, not with a dramatic confession, not with the promise that every feeling is returned, or that every unfinished story eventually finds its ending. Life isn't that neat. Human beings certainly aren't. But there is something I want you to sit with for a moment, something many men spend years overlooking. The people who affect us most are not always the people who stayed. They're often the people who revealed something important about us. And sometimes when a woman wants to hold you tightly and say something, the words have less to do with what she feels about you, and more to do with what your presence awakened inside her. Because beneath all the attraction, all the wondering, all the hesitation, most people are searching for the same thing: connection. Not attention. Connection. There's a difference. Attention feels good. Connection changes you. Attention makes you feel noticed. Connection makes you feel seen. Connection makes you feel known. And being known is one of the most vulnerable experiences a person can have. That's why genuine emotional closeness feels so powerful. Not because another person completes you, but because they witness parts of you that usually remain hidden. The parts beneath the confidence, beneath the jokes, beneath the image you show the world. The part that still hopes, still fears, still wonders if it's truly enough. If you've ever felt deeply connected to someone, you know exactly what I mean. You stop caring about impressing them. You start caring about being understood by them. And that's a very different kind of desire, a much deeper one. Which brings me back to the thought that opened this conversation. The possibility that somewhere, someone wishes she could sit beside you right now. No distractions, no expectations, no complicated explanations. Just honesty, pure honesty. And maybe she'd tell you she misses the conversations. Maybe she'd tell you she still remembers things you've forgotten. Maybe she'd tell you that your kindness arrived during a difficult chapter. Maybe she'd tell you that you mattered, more than she ever admitted. But if I'm being completely truthful, the most meaningful words might be even simpler than that. They might simply be, thank you. Thank you for being yourself. Thank you for the conversations. Thank you for the moments that felt real. Thank you for showing me something I needed to learn. Thank you for leaving a mark worth remembering. Because mature emotions eventually move beyond possession. They move beyond control, beyond the desperate need for outcomes. They begin to appreciate meaning itself. And meaning is rare, far rarer than most people realize. So if you've spent years wondering whether certain moments mattered, whether certain connections were real, whether someone ever felt more than they showed, Don't rush to answer those questions tonight. Just consider this. Human beings are far more emotionally complex than they appear. People carry entire worlds inside them, entire conversations, entire confessions, entire histories that never reach the surface. The strongest feelings are not always the loudest. The deepest truths are not always spoken. And sometimes, the words someone most wants to say remain hidden behind a quiet smile, a lingering glance, or a goodbye that felt strangely unfinished. Not because those feelings were small, because they were important. Important enough to be protected, important enough to be feared, important enough to be remembered. So if you're alone right now, listening to my voice in the quiet part of your evening, I hope you remember this. Your worth is not determined by who stayed. Your worth is not measured by who spoke up. And your value is not dependent on whether every story reached the ending you hoped for. Sometimes the most meaningful thing you can understand is this. You may never hear every word that lived inside another person's heart, but that doesn't mean those words were never there. And for certain people, the sentence they've been carrying for far too long is still waiting in the silence, waiting for a moment of courage, waiting for a moment of truth, waiting to finally become a voice. And perhaps tonight, for the first time, you understand why.